today my friend Rebecca George is joining us, and it is just so fun to get to watch you living out your dreams on social media, but it's even more fun to get to talk with you in person today about your new book that just released this year. But before we get into all that, tell us just a little bit about yourself, where you live, who you spend your days with, what you spend your days doing, just so everyone can get to know you a little bit better.
Sure, Candace, I'm so thankful to be here. Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to chat with you today. So, again, like you said, my name is Rebecca George. I'm a pastor's wife, first and foremost. So, we do not have any children yet, but my husband and my dog that's who I share my home with. And I also, like you said, am a speaker and an author and a podcast host. I host the podcast called Radical Radiance, which really seeks to equip women with conversations that will teach us more about what it actually looks like to radiate the heart of Christ in all that we do. And so the book is a really kind of an offshoot of that, right? What does it look like to see our work and our calling from a gospel-centered perspective? And so I love having those types of conversations and excited that we get to chat about that today.
Yes. And even more, doing all of that, being a pastor's wife is a job in and of itself, caring for the congregation, and you don't get paid for it, but it is a full-time job. But then also writing and podcasting, and then you also create really cute earrings out of clay.
Oh yeah, I do that too. Yes. Yes. So I have an Etsy shop, and Candace, this has been such a fun, almost just way to rest for me, to be honest, which sounds weird because it's like I do make money from it and I do have a business doing it. But I have found for me, and maybe you'll relate to this, we work with our minds so much, right? Like with writing and speaking and podcasting, you're creating content a lot. And so I actually find it really restful to rest with my hands and to create things when I really need time to just decompress. And so I actually, rather than just like sitting in front of the couch watching a movie, I would way rather like to spend time with my husband, right? Like maybe he's watching a movie and maybe I'm sitting at our kitchen table across the room from him working on clay earrings, right? And so clay was something that I started doing about a year and a half ago. And so, yeah, it's a really fun part of something I just kind of do in my free time. So I make what I want to make and I sell what I sell, but it's so fun.
And they're so cute. And I do relate to that. I mean, I think writing, it's so much head work, head and heart, and mental, but also just like whether it's gardening or playing volleyball or kayaking or something, like just that movement, that activity is restful for me too, which you wouldn't necessarily think kayaking is restful, but it is. It kind of frees up my mental space and then allows for more creativity. So
yes, I love it.
Well, your new book, like we said, it just released this year and it's hot off the press. So congratulations, first and foremost, on that. That is such a wonderful achievement, but also just God's timing to release this message. This was the time when he wanted it to release into the world. But I want you to get to tell us the title because I think it's something that we can all relate to. And I'd also like to hear why this message was so important, why you felt it was so important to share.
Yeah. So the book's title is Do the Thing, Gospel-Centered Goals, Gumption, and Grace for the Go-Getter Girl. And yeah, to answer your question, it really started, I guess, brewing, if you will, in me several years ago. I led a ministry for about 5 years after my mom's cancer journey. We donated handmade hats and handwritten letters of encouragement to cancer treatment centers all over the country. And so as we were partnering with these different organizations, God would open these doors for me to speak to church groups and women's ministries about what God was doing. And as I did that, and Candace, you'll relate to this, I would get done speaking and I would meet women, at the back of the room or whatever, and they would tell me their stories. And almost every time I had a very similar conversation. They would come up to me and say, I love what God did through your mom's testimony of what she went through and what he's led you to do as a result of that. And I feel like I have my own version of that, right? I feel God stirring my heart to start something new or to get involved in this particular area. And then they would almost grow quiet, and there would be something that was holding them back almost every time, whether it was fear, doubt, insecurity, comparison. Maybe they were looking to the world for what the world had to say about their calling and them using their gifts and talents. And there's certainly a lot of books on shelves about that we've all read in the last 5 to 10 years, that in my experience has left us, or at least left me, very exhausted and haven't really pointed me towards biblical truth as it pertains to how, I use my gifts and talents for the glory of God. And so the more conversations I had like that, the more God kept stirring this in my heart of, okay, where's the book that will point women back to scripture and what it says about our calling? And how do we be faithful in the midst of the mundane when God calls us into something new, when maybe an assignment that we thought was going to last longer actually ends sooner than we thought, and God invites us into maybe a new area of ministry? How do we manage all of those times that we all experience, but maybe we don't take time to sit back and really process through that with the Lord? And so we can get into a lot more about how it's organized, but that's kind of the long and short of where God has had me and how we got to the book. So.
Well, and I think it's so neat to get to have you on the podcast right now, because we're in this mini series on overcoming and overcoming different areas of our life. And, in a lot of us, like you just mentioned a few of them, but we have these laundry list of excuses of why we shouldn't do something, or why maybe we don't feel like we can do something. We don't feel equipped. We don't feel like we have the resources, the know-how, all those things. And we rehearse those thoughts again and again in our minds. And then the doubt is the voice that we listen to. It becomes louder than the voice of faith. And in your book, Do the Thing, you talk about our thoughts, and you teach us to have an eternal perspective for our calling. And so can you just expand on that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I think something that we don't talk about enough is our thought life and how it impacts us being able to move forward in faith, right? And so the Lord really challenged me in this over the last several years, and something that I do talk about in the book, but I'll share today, that is a framework that I think has really been powerful in my own life, that's really rooted in scripture, is this. If we look to this passage in Philippians 4, if you've been in the church for a very long time, you may have memorized as a kid, or you've certainly heard it or seen it posted on, somebody's wall in their home. It's everywhere. It's this passage where Paul talks about what we should think about, right? And he talks about thinking about what is lovely, what is pure, what is worthy of praise. And so I think sometimes when we feel, let's just say, fearful about taking that next step in our calling, maybe we feel like we don't have what it takes, or we don't have time to take that next step forward. What if we stepped back and said, okay, what about what I'm believing about this fear that I'm feeling? What about it is true? Okay, maybe I am busy, but does that mean that I don't have time to be faithful in what God's called me to do? No, I can sit back and think, okay, where do I carve out time to take that next step? And so maybe it's the what's true question that's getting you. Maybe it's is this worthy of praise? Is the way that I'm thinking about this particular situation praiseworthy? Does it honor God, right? And if that's not true, the next most important question that I think we can ask ourselves is, okay, what is true? What is praiseworthy in these types of situations? And so I think really in a sense, taking our thoughts captive in that way and asking those questions, working through that framework of what I'm believing, is it true? And then what is truth, and replacing those things with biblical truth when we are struggling. And so I think that's an area that, if we're all honest, we struggle with in our calling from time to time, and there's different reasons for that. But at the root of it, we see so many great truths in scripture of, we have the mind of Christ. We're called to take our thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ. And what does that look like? Sometimes it just means taking a step back and kind of journaling through that process. And so that's something that I know has helped me. So whether you have the book or not, you can just grab a journal and walk through that passage in Philippians. And I've found that to be really helpful when I'm struggling in my thought life.
Yes. And like you said, taking our thoughts captive, making, like the messiness of our thoughts, but also sometimes we get through that and we are focusing on what is true and what is praiseworthy, but our goals, like they can just feel overwhelming. Like we have all of these things. So how are we going to get from here to there? And it just feels overwhelming, even when we are focused on the truth and the praiseworthy, that piece. And so in your book, one thing that I thought was very practical that as a visual learner, I appreciate, and I know many of the listeners will want to hear more about this, is how you help with a Venn diagram graphic to help organize our goals and to help us know what our next step is. So can you kind of just tell us a little bit more of how you've done that and what that looks like?
Yeah, I would love to. So, this is something, again, that I've found helpful in my own life. And it's kind of walking through, where do I feel called? And how am I using those gifts and talents that God's given me and connecting that to a need maybe that I see in the world, right? And so to your point, what you said was a Venn diagram. So if we think back to like maybe elementary school, we were learning how to compare and contrast things, right? That's where I maybe first saw a Venn diagram. And this Venn diagram that we walk through, that if you're listening today, you can just grab a pen and paper and do it right there while you're listening. And so the first circle that we walk through is what matters to you, right? Take some time to sit back and think through, what are the specific ways that I feel God has given me gifts and talents that I can use to build his kingdom, right? So for me and you, Candace, we could think through that and say, okay, I feel that God has given me the gift of encouragement, and I love to write and I love to speak. So those might be some of the things that might fill our circle if we were to go through this exercise. The second circle says what matters to God, right? And so we walk through that and we would think of things probably like building his church, right? Biblical truth and pointing women back to that. God cares a whole lot about that. And we get to do that in the work that you and I do. And then the third circle is what matters to other people, right? What's a need that we see in the world, and how do our gifts and talents and what matters to God meet that need that we might see in the world? And so, for me right now, I look around and I see a lot of women who feel distracted and stuck in their calling, and getting out of that matters to them, right? I think we all at our core, we want to be faithful. We want to use our gifts and talents to the glory of God. And so my intersection point of those three bubbles is, in the sense, this book, right? And that's one of the ways that I'm using my own gifts and talents to glorify God. And so I think for the listener coming to this conversation today, you can put your own story in those three circles, right? Within your own community and where God has placed you in this season, and see where those things intersect. And then I think it helps inform our time, how we spend our time, how we are taking next steps of obedience, and what that looks like maybe in the latter part of this year when people are listening to this episode. And so that is definitely an exercise that I have found helpful in my own life and in the lives of others as we continue to walk out our calling.
Yeah. And I think that is so helpful, and to write it down, to really make it very tangible and understand these are the different pieces. And this is where I need to pour my energy and gifts. Like, these are the gifts I've been given. This is where I'm going to pour my energy. And also to remember that as Christians, that we're not alone in doing this. And there's one thing that you talk about in your book, and you call it spirit-led stick-to-itiveness. And I think the key word there is spirit-led. And I think sometimes I know for my own self, whenever I get overwhelmed, even when I know I'm walking in my calling, but where I can have a tendency to be overwhelmed is whenever I'm looking at myself, when I'm looking at my own strength, my own know-how, and I don't see yet the doors that God has opened. I don't see the connections, the people that he's placed in